All right, I've turned this on, and Dr. Baxter, we do have your permission to record, that's right? Well, I'm wondering, I realize, well, if you could describe perhaps where you were and what you did see, what sort of vantage point you had as far as the head goes, and if you could indicate perhaps with this pen what you do remember of the wound that you saw.
Well, it's very difficult with a skull to say anything because the president has a huge amount of hair, very thick and bushy, and it overlays all the wounds. So, of course, in those few minutes, those of us that were working were doing physiologic things to try to get survival. We knew that the head wound was extremely bad because the eyes were very protuberant, already blue from the hemorrhage inside the skull. Just, he had severe exophthalmos. It was hard to even recognize him as the president. So, the way that there's been such a huge head injury, obviously a lethal one, and we were working all down here in front.
Where were you exactly in relation to his body? Around the chest area, or?
Yeah. I was down working with tracheotomy, chest tubes.
You would have been on his left side or his right side?
I was on his right.
His right. You did have a chance to examine the head wound somewhat, although not very closely?
Right. I just took a look when Dr. Clark was up. He's the man who really knows the head wound because he is, the chief of neurosurgery.
Right.
He came into the room, and we were losing him. I mean, we didn't have anything to lose. It was already a loss, but we could see things beginning to deteriorate in terms of heartbeat, etc. And so I asked him to take a quick look if we had anything salvageable above, and he went up and examined the head wound. And the only time I saw that wound was when Kemp had the hair pulled up and the temporal plate right in this area was just laid back. And that does not, from the standpoint of where a bullet came from, I know I did.
Sure.
Because it could have come this way, it could have come this way, it could have come from above. The only thing that it was such a blow that plate was shattered and out.
So you actually saw it just an open and out, a space of absent skull in that area?
Can I see where you've drawn that?
Yes, and I have no idea whether that's accurate or not.
You don't?
But
how far down, what would you say the bottom margin, as best as you can recall, would be on that?
Is there any occipital portion of this wound, or as you're drawing it, or mostly?
Well, I think there is. I think there is, but I never saw that. I can only tell you I saw it from here.
You never got to the back of the head?
No, never was it. And of course, the silly problem is that once the president was dead, he backed off from the body with the reverence that anyone had. Suddenly the sadness and everything else hit you, the atrocity hit you, and you just paid homage to it. And I never examined the body again after we didn't really pronounce him dead till the priest had administered the last rites, but I had nothing more to do with it.
But it's clear in your mind that at least once you pulled the hair, or Dr. Clark pulled the hair out of the way, that you could see that wound even with his head lying back on the back of the head on that table.
Kemp's comment was, my God, his whole head shot off, the temporal plates destroyed. And, that's all I really know about it.
But you sort of had some confirmation of what he said with your own eyes, as you looked at it from your admittedly not ideal vantage point.
Yeah.
Clark, in his testimony before the Warren Commission, called it a gaping wound in the right posterior part, with cerebral and cerebellar tissue being damaged and exposed. But you're putting it slightly more forward than that. Is that correct?
I just saw the forwardmost damage. I didn't see any of what Dr. Clark described.
So it's possible that the wound could have extended further back in the occipital region, but you just didn't see it?
Well, doubtless so, and I didn't see it because that was his sole job, was examining that wound.
So you think that you may be drawing just a portion of the wound?
Yeah, I'm almost certain of it.
All right, let me show you this photograph, if I could, a tracing of a photograph done. This is a photograph taken at the autopsy of President Kennedy, showing the rear of the head. This is the tracing, which purports to be accurate to a hair, showing the rear of the president's head just before the autopsy began in Bethesda. How would that photograph square with what you saw at the time?
Well, I don't see so much in this photograph that helps me.
In terms of what?
Well, I can't tell where any of the damage is. It looks like that's some sort of entry wound back there.
We're looking at that small piece of, that's been described as a piece of tissue, I guess.
Well, the official House committee conclusion was that this wound up here in the cowlick area was the entry wound, and that this is brain tissue, although there's controversy about this point. Humes, the autopsist, initially considered this to be the entry wound, as did his other two partners. Later they were able to get Humes to say that this was the entry wound. But some doctors have described occipital parietal damage, which does not appear to be evident here. There is a flap of bone up here, but we're asking each doctor to examine this to see how it squares with what they recall.
It's this flap of bone that I saw, that I'm describing.
Somewhere in this area.
And none of these things did I see at all.
Is that compatible with what, is there anything about that would conflict with your memory of what you saw?
No.
Okay.
But there should be, you wonder if pathologists with the time to examine that would be able to say whether that was an entry wound or an exit wound, if you're thinking posterior or anterior.
Part of the confusion stemmed from the fact that they didn't use these photographs when they were preparing the autopsy report. They wrote up the report based on measurements and made some rough sketches. Then when the photographs were first made available, actually not until several years later, they themselves were in doubt as to whether this or this was the entry wound that they had described earlier. That's one of the sources of the confusion in this whole area.
That what you have in your hand is Volume 7 of the House Assassinations Committee final report issued last year. Can I show you another drawing, Doctor?
Yeah, this one makes sense as related to the other one.
Which one is this?
This is a drawing on page 117 showing a bullet hole in the cowlick area, I would guess.
Although I never saw either one of these.
You never saw those, yeah.
The only one he had that I saw was right there.
Sure. Would you
could you do what you did on the skull on paper as well?
Sure. But it looked like to me that what we're really looking at there is right behind the coronal suture. That we were looking at a bone flap that could have been this big. Certainly didn't come all the way down to there, but
flipped down or to the side?
That was flipped out. And I would say that it was, your memory is sort of that it extended back where you couldn't see and went back here. What I actually saw, you could put right in there.
So you're saying again that you only saw a portion of the wound, Sergeant?
Now, this solid line you've drawn here, what does that represent, Dr. Baxter?
Well, that's what I would think the extent of the bone
I see, but
flap
what you
was,
saw is
what
what's
I
on the
saw.
dotted line.
Could you do it on the other skull as well? On the rear view?
Shows.
From the rear view, it would definitely come over. See, I couldn't see back that far. I would have to say that I could not see over that ridge, so mine would be no view.
All right. Let me show you this.
So that's where you just ain't got it.
Sure, I understand.
Let me show you this picture. Dr. McClellan testified that he had a clear view of the rear of the head, and he testified in some detail to a right posterior wound. He said, I'm quoting, that he was in such a position that he could very closely examine the head wound. He noted that the right posterior portion of the skull had been extremely blasted. Goes on to describe in some detail that wound. Based on his description, an author for a book had this sketch prepared. Now I want to stress that Dr. McClellan did not prepare this sketch, but based on McClellan's description to the Warren Commission, that sketch was prepared. Could you comment on that?
This, in our conversations, or my conversations with the rest of the people, this would be a reasonably accurate, drawing of what McClellan was trying to describe and what Kemp was describing.
It was.
But yet that flap was out, up front, so it's not complete. This would sort of be the entry blast wound, and the way we sort of lined it up was what McClellan described as seeing that temporal plate laying out there was more keeping with the entry here and the blast that just blew the rest off.
Could that be an exit wound? Seems to be an evulsive effect there, a coning effect with these edges blasted out here. Is that consistent?
I'd say it's consistent with either one.
Mm-hmm.
But you're saying that in your memory, then there was a wound. From what you've heard, there may have been a wound that size in that portion of the skull. In addition to the one you saw, a large one on the side, in the more temporal parietal area.
Well, I didn't think of it as two wounds.
I see. You thought it was one. But isn't that considerably more to the rear of the head than what you've drawn? It doesn't seem to extend anywhere near as far forward as what you would call.
No.
He's saying that you're saying then that there was private conversation among the doctors after the fact, and people like Clark and McClellan told you that they saw such a wound.
Well, I don't recall that in fact. It was just my impression overall. Right? It's not. I don't recall any specific conversations, or we have never, between any of us, had any sat down and tried to figure out and got a complete description between any of us. So all that I'm reliable for is that temporal plate.
But what you're saying is what you're saying between the two, what you've drawn on the skull and what you see there, is that the wound you saw began considerably further forward than what you see there, but may have extended back that far. You know, or you just don't know. But
I just don't know.
Right. But what you've heard suggests that it would be consistent with what that shows.
Yes. All right. I'll show you this other drawing, done by someone who viewed the autopsy photographs, showing a gaping wound in the temporal parietal area. That perhaps would be consistent with what you saw.
This is my impression exactly. Some entry wound back here, whether it's that low or not, and then blowing off this plate.
We're referring to the drawing done by Latimer now, for the record. That, however, you'll notice does not show a wound which extends back to the occiput. There seems to be an end to it in the temporal parietal area. You said earlier that your wound, you believe, did extend to the occipital area.
No. I said I don't have no idea.
All right.
Because all I saw is this plate right there out. And what you do with it from there, I have no idea. Because we were thinking entirely different in those few minutes because of this wound in front. It was such a benign wound that we thought it was an entry wound. I mean, that was our initial impression, because I never saw this one. There was no...
Last question, Dr. Baxter. Do you recall what type of tissue you saw either inside or emerging from that wound?
I don't. All I saw was blood and hair. And I was surprised to know, but not surprised alone, really, that there was a lot of scrambled brain mixed in the area. And one of the people that took the president out of the car said that there was brain all over everywhere. too.
And again, without pulling back the hair, it was very difficult to see just what the margins of that head wound were.
Yeah, in those few minutes, you know, it's just covered with blood. And until you wash out and get some real, you know, it's like any other one. You can't tell what's going on.
You told the Warren Commission then that you observed that the cerebellum was present. I'm quoting here, the damage was beyond hope. That is, in a word, literally, the right side of his head had been blown off. With this and the observation that the cerebellum was present, a large quantity of brain was present on the card. Well, we felt that such an additional heroic attempt was not warranted, and we did not pronounce him dead, but ceased our efforts and awaited the priest and last rites before we pronounced him dead.
That part of the statement that I made was based a great deal on Kent's observations of brain. Yeah, I saw some brain, as I recall, but I don't know. I know that I did not see enough to say that his cerebellum was there and intact or gone. Other people told me that they had cerebellum out on the cart, but
Would that suggest, based on your medical expertise, the fact that cerebellum was present on the cart, would that suggest a occipital wound to the rear of the head?
not particularly, because that's such a hell of a blast injury that actually you could have had cerebellum destroyed when the entry wound would be front left. You know, it wouldn't, you know, just a contusion, because it's just like hitting you in the head with an axe. A huge blow, it's just going to explode. So it's very difficult to put any connotation on that sort of thing, because you have to remember that the brain is in a case where any increase in pressure is what gets you in trouble.
Okay. One final question, if I could here.
They did remove the brain at the autopsy in Bethesda, didn't they? They did.
Well, there seems to be some controversy about that. In your medical report that you wrote that day, you said that the occipital bone was missing. Do you recall what the basis for that was?
No, I don't. I know that you got more information from that written report than I can give you today, because that's the reason we wrote them. We wrote them down. That's the one thing I had everybody to do, was to get off right then and write up everything that they had knowledge of or memory of.
While it was fresh in your mind.
Yeah, and that's the record. And that will be more accurate than the emotional and the talking and communication and supposing that went on since that time, because that was de novo observation. I didn't let McClellan talk to Perry, to Clark, to me, to Peters, to anybody else. We all went off and wrote what we saw. And I think there was probably very little conflict in what everybody wrote down.
You suggested that in your Warren Commission testimony, you did rely to some extent on hearsay based on what Clark told you.
Yeah.
In your written report, would you also have relied on hearsay?
No more than the actual time. As I mentioned, as we began to lose the president, we knew he was going to die, and at least he was going to have a cardiac arrest. I asked him if there was any, give me the status of the brain, or how bad's the head injury, I think is the way I put it at the time. And he said, my God, his head's shot off. And I said, you mean not salvageable in any way? And he said, no way. And so that's when we did not
Do the heroic attempts.
The heroic attempts, because all you were going to be doing was saving a man without anything above the neck, and you couldn't have saved him. But that answered all the questions right there, of what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and that's where it stopped. So whether he said the occipital plate is missing or what, the details today completely escaped me, so I really don't know.
You don't remember if he said that, or you saw it and wrote it yourself?
Right. I really don't.
The occipital plate, of course, is in the rear of the head, and you told us that you didn't see the back of the head, so perhaps it was from Clark?
Yeah, my vantage point was not such that unless I walked around there and looked at it, I couldn't see.
And if the occipital plate was missing, that would be consistent with a gaping wound in the back of the head, correct? Something that you did not see.
But one of the things, now that I think about it, is that in order to do a tracheotomy, we always have a hyperextended head.
Mm-hmm.
So you're tending to have more down under that you can't see in that position. Now, whether Kemp later lifted it up and looked down low when you're talking about, I don't know, but in the position that the president was in, a lot of the very lower parts of the head would be hidden from anybody.
Was his head hanging off the edge of the stretcher so that the chin could be thrust up more, or what?
That I don't remember.
Okay.
Okay.